I never imagined that my son's wedding would be the moment I became invisible. Not because I wasn't invited. I was there, sitting in the second row, wearing my best suit, hands folded tightly in my lap. Invisible because no one looked at me, not really. Their eyes slid past me as if I were part of the furniture, necessary but unimportant. The room was filled with polished smiles, designer clothes, and quiet calculations. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a transaction. But before, if you want more real-life stories that touch the heart and reveal the truth behind family, love, and betrayal, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I saw it in the way her family spoke, every word measured, every laugh rehearsed. Their pride didn't come from love, it came from numbers, titles, and appearances. And my son stood there beside her, stiff in a suit that didn't quite feel like him anymore. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was just an old parent struggling to let go. But deep down, I knew something had shifted long before. That day, he hadn't married for love. He had married for status. And I was the inconvenient reminder of a life he was trying to leave behind. The signs had been there for years. The shorter phone calls, the excuses, the way he stopped asking for advice and started announcing decisions. He spoke differently now about investments, about circles, about how important it was to be seen with the right people, and every time money came up, he'd glance at me, almost instinctively, as if measuring how far I could follow him into this new world. I kept quiet. I always did, because parents like me are taught something early on: support first, question later, and never stand in the way of your child's happiness, even if it costs you your dignity. The first time I met her, she barely shook my hand. Her smile was polite but distant. Her eyes scanned my clothes, my shoes, my posture. She asked what I did for work, and when I answered, her interest vanished like smoke. She didn't ask about my life. She asked about my house. How big was it? Was it paid off? Did I plan to retire soon? I answered honestly, and with every answer, her smile thinned. Later, my son pulled me aside and whispered, "She's just curious." Don't take it personally, but it was personal because curiosity doesn't feel like judgment. I watched him change after that. He started correcting the way I spoke, telling me which restaurants were appropriate, advising me not to talk about old struggles in front of her family. "Let's not embarrass anyone," he said once, laughing lightly. I laughed too, but something inside me cracked, because embarrassment wasn't something I'd ever felt about my life, until my own son taught me to. I wanted to tell him the truth, that everything he had, the education, the opportunities, confidence, came from sacrifices he never saw, from nights I skipped meals, from jobs I never talked about, from choices that kept me awake long after he fell asleep safely under my roof. But I stayed silent because he didn't want the truth. He wanted the image. The wedding day confirmed it. Her family dominated the room. Their guests filled the front rows. Their names echoed in speeches. Their wealth was praised openly. And when it was time for parents to speak, I wasn't asked. No microphone, no acknowledgement, just a polite nod from across the room. I sat there, clapping when expected, smiling when required, shrinking when necessary. At the reception, her father gave a long speech about aligning futures and mutual benefit. People laughed, glasses clinked, my son beamed, and I realized with a slow, heavy ache that he believed this was success. He had traded warmth for validation, and he thought he had one. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the version of me they dismissed was only half the story, because while they saw an aging parent with modest habits and simple clothes, they had no idea what I had built quietly, no idea what I had protected, no idea what sat untouched, unseen, and unspoken. A secret account, one I never mentioned, one I never needed applause for, one that existed not to impress, but to endure, and one day it would change everything. After the wedding, I expected things to improve. That's what people say, isn't it? Once the stress is over, everything settles. But stress wasn't the problem. The problem was that my son no longer saw me as part of his future, only as a leftover from his past. The calls stopped first, not suddenly, not dramatically. They simply faded. Weekly check-ins became monthly texts. Conversations shrank to updates, not connection. He spoke fast, distracted, as if every minute spent with me was borrowed from something more important. And when I visited their new home for the first time, I understood why. It was beautiful, large, immaculate, cold, everything matched. Everything shined, everything looked like it belonged in a magazine, and nothing felt lived in. His wife greeted me politely, but her eyes carried a warning. This wasn't my space. She offered coffee without asking how I took it. She corrected where I placed my shoes. She hovered while I sat, as if afraid I might damage something just by existing. My son noticed. He said nothing. That silence hurt more than her tone ever could. At dinner, conversation revolved around investments, properties, and long-term growth. I listened quietly, nodding when appropriate. When I spoke once, just once, about how proud I was of him, she smiled thinly and changed the subject. Later, as I prepared to leave, she handed me leftovers wrapped neatly in foil. "Just in case," she said, glancing at my coat. "I don't know what you usually eat." I thanked her, because that's what people like me do. We swallow humiliation to keep peace. In the car, I sat for a long moment before starting the engine. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from grief, because the boy I raised to be kind, respectful, and grounded had become someone who allowed others to belittle me, so he wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable, and that hurt in a way no insult ever could. Over time, her comments grew sharper, subtle but deliberate. She joked about old school thinking. She laughed about people who never upgraded. She asked, loudly, if I planned to downsize soon. My son smiled awkwardly, still saying nothing. One evening, she said something that finally broke the illusion I'd been clinging to. Honestly, she laughed, swirling her glass. "It's impressive how you survived on so little for so long." Survived, as if my life had been a mistake I somehow endured. The room went quiet. I looked at my son, waiting, hoping. He shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. "She doesn't mean anything by it," he said quickly. "You know how she jokes." That was the moment something inside me hardened, not toward her, toward him, because he had just chosen comfort over character. Again, I realized then that my silence had taught him something dangerous, that I would always absorb the damage so others wouldn't have to feel guilty, and that had to stop. But I didn't confront them, not yet, because I wasn't ready, and because they still believed the same thing, that I had nothing left to offer but inconvenience. They didn't know that every dismissive comment, every mocking smile, every careless assumption was building toward a truth they weren't prepared to face. And when that truth surfaced, it wouldn't need shouting. It would speak for itself. Silence has a cost. I learned that slowly, over years of swallowing words that deserved to be spoken. At first, silence felt like maturity, like strength. I believed that if I stayed calm, if I didn't react, if I kept my dignity intact, things would naturally correct themselves. They rarely do. Silence doesn't teach respect. It teaches people how much they can get away with. After that dinner, the one where survived on so little, became a joke. I went home and sat alone at my kitchen table long after midnight. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I replayed everything. Every moment I'd laughed something off. Every time I'd said it's fine when it wasn't. Every chance I'd had to remind my son who I was, and who he was becoming. I wondered when I had stopped being his parent and started being his liability. That question hurt more than anything else. Weeks passed. They didn't call. I didn't either. Not out of curiosity. I wanted to know what would happen if I stopped reaching. The answer was clear. Nothing happened. No concern. No check-in. No "are you okay?" The silence stretched, and with it came clarity. I had been holding the relationship together by myself, and now that I'd let go, it simply drifted. That realization changed something in me, because love that requires constant effort from only one side isn't love, it's obligation. Then came the first request. It always does. My son called one afternoon, his voice unusually careful. "Hey," he said, like we'd spoken yesterday, "we need to talk." I listened, not eagerly, not fearfully, just neutrally. "We're thinking about making some financial moves." He continued, "and we wanted your input." Input, not concern, not connection, just usefulness. I asked a simple question. "What kind of input?" There was a pause. "Well, you've always been good with budgeting," he said. We're considering refinancing, and I stopped him gently. I thought you and your wife had advisors for that. Another pause. We do, he admitted, but they charge. There it was, the unspoken expectation that my time, my experience, my mental labor would always be free, because that's how it had always been. I told him I'd think about it. He sounded relieved, not grateful, relieved. After we hung up, I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. Tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. That night, I opened the folder I rarely touched, the one locked away in the back of my drawer, the one no one knew about. Inside were documents spanning decades, accounts, investments, careful planning born from years of restraint, not wealth built for show, but security. I hadn't told my son about it for one simple reason. I wanted him to build his life without leaning on my safety net. I wanted him to succeed on his own. What I hadn't realized was that my secrecy had allowed him, and now his wife, to assume something worse, that I had nothing, that I was barely getting by, that I was lesser, and they treated me accordingly. I closed the folder and slid it back into place. Not yet. I wasn't ready to reveal anything, because money reveals don't just change how people see you, they expose who they already are. I needed to be sure. Days later, we met again, this time at their home. She was different now, warmer, politer. She offered coffee and asked about my health. It felt rehearsed, as if someone had reminded her I might still be useful. She asked carefully about my plans. If I intended to travel, if I'd considered moving closer, if I needed help managing things. I smiled and said I was doing just fine. She exchanged a glance with my son, and in that moment I understood something chilling. They were assessing me, not as family, as risk, as potential burden, as a future problem to be minimized. That was when the weight of my silence finally became unbearable, because staying quiet wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It was enabling disrespect, and something had to change. There's a thin line between concern and control. I didn't see it clearly at first, because it was disguised as kindness. After that visit, the tone of their communication shifted. Suddenly, they were calling more often, checking in, asking questions they'd never cared to ask before. How are you feeling lately? Have you thought about your long-term plans? Do you have everything organized, just in case? Just in case. That phrase followed me everywhere. At first, I appreciated the attention. It felt like care. Like maybe they were finally realizing they'd pulled away too far. But then the suggestion started. You know, my daughter-in-law said one afternoon, a lot of parents your age choose to simplify their lives. Simplify. She spoke gently, smiling, as if offering wisdom. Smaller places are easier to manage, she continued. Less responsibility. Less stress. I nodded, waiting. And being closer to family is always better. She added casually, you never know when you might need help. Help, there it was. I asked calmly, help with what? She hesitated just for a moment. Well, things, she said. Life gets harder as you get older. My son sat beside her, silent again. That silence spoke volumes. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the inconvenience I might become. I started noticing patterns. Every conversation circled back to my house, my health, my independence, never my happiness, never my wants, never my boundaries. One evening, my son said something that made everything clear. We've been talking. He began carefully, and we think it might be smart for you to start thinking about downsizing sooner rather than later. We, not I. They mattered, and what happens then? I asked. Well, he said, avoiding my eyes, you could move closer to us. That way we can keep an eye on things. Keep an eye on things. I realized then that this wasn't about love. It was about control. They wanted proximity, not connection. They wanted access, not understanding. And most of all, they wanted certainty that I wouldn't disrupt the carefully curated life they'd built, a life that had no space for aging parents unless they were predictable, quiet, and inexpensive. I asked another question. Have I given you any reason to think I can't manage my own life? He hesitated. No, he admitted. But nothing. I said gently. That was the first time I interrupted him. The air shifted. He wasn't used to that. His wife smiled tightly and changed the subject, but the message had been delivered. They were planning around me without me. That night, I went home and sat with my thoughts. I wasn't angry. I was disappointed because I had raised my son to value people, not appearances, to protect the vulnerable, not measure their usefulness. Somewhere along the way, he had learned different priorities, and I couldn't ignore that anymore. I thought about the secret I carried, the accounts, the assets, the years of discipline. I thought about how differently this conversation would sound if they knew, how their concern would turn into admiration, how control would become respect, and that thought unsettled me deeply, because respect that only appears when money is revealed isn't respect at all, it's calculation. I decided then that when I revealed the truth, when I finally opened that door, it wouldn't be to win their approval. It would be to expose their assumptions, to show them the cost of judging a life by appearances, but not yet. They still needed to show me who they truly were. There's a particular kind of pain that comes when you realize people aren't asking how you are. They're asking how long you'll last. That realization didn't come in one dramatic moment. It came through patterns, through tone, through timing. After the conversations about downsizing and keeping an eye on things, I noticed how carefully they spoke around me. Every word felt pre-approved, filtered through concern that wasn't really concern. They started scheduling things for me, appointments I hadn't asked for, recommendations I hadn't requested, plans that assumed my compliance. One afternoon, my son called and said, "We booked a consultation for you." I blinked. A consultation? Yes, he said quickly, just to talk about options. No pressure. Options for what? Living arrangements. He clarified. I closed my eyes. This wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a process. I didn't agree to that. I said calmly. He sounded surprised. "We just thought it would be helpful." Helpful, that word again. I asked him something I should have asked long ago. "Do you think I'm incapable of deciding what's best for myself?" Silence, not denial, not reassurance. Silence. That silence was louder than any answer. His wife took over the call. She had perfected that tone. Soft, reasonable, impossible to argue with without sounding defensive. "No one is saying that," she said. "We're just trying to be proactive." Proactive? Another word that sounded harmless until you felt its weight. "Life is unpredictable," she continued, "and we have a responsibility to plan ahead." I finally said what had been building inside me. A responsibility to whom? There it was again, that pause. "You," she answered, "and us." And us, that's when it became clear. This wasn't about my comfort. It was about minimizing their future inconvenience. They weren't preparing to support me. They were preparing to manage me. I declined the consultation, politely. Firmly, the reaction was immediate. Concern turned into irritation. My son accused me gently of being stubborn. His wife suggested, politely, that I was in denial. Neither asked why I felt the way I did. They didn't want my perspective. They wanted my compliance. That night, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the life I had built, the furniture I'd paid for slowly, the walls that had heard laughter, arguments, quiet prayers, the proof that I had lived fully, responsibly, independently. And they wanted me to shrink it all down into something manageable, something convenient, something easy to overlook. I thought back to all the years I had done the same for them, how I'd adjusted my life around their needs, how I'd postponed my own comfort, how I'd told myself this is what love looks like. But love isn't erasure. Love doesn't turn people into problems to solve. That was the night I made a quiet decision. I would not argue. I would not beg. And I would not reveal my secret to defend myself, not yet, because I wanted them to continue believing what they believed. I wanted them to continue acting as they were, so that when the truth finally surfaced, there would be no room for excuses. There are nights when the past doesn't knock. It walks in like it owns the place. That was happening more often now. Memories I had buried under responsibility and routine began resurfacing, uninvited, vivid, relentless, not because I was nostalgic, but because I was finally still enough to feel them. I remembered my son as a child, how he used to wait by the door when I came home from work, how he would run toward me, arms wide, shouting my name like it meant safety, how he once told me, "When I grow up, I want to take care of you." I used to smile at that. Now it echoed painfully, because somewhere along the way, taking care had become taking control, and love had been replaced by management. The pressure from them didn't stop after I declined the consultation. It intensified, just subtly enough to avoid confrontation. My daughter-in-law started sending me articles. Helpful reads, she called them. Articles about aging, about early planning, about how families struggle when parents wait too long to make decisions. Each message ended with a smile emoji. I didn't respond. Then came the financial angle. My son asked questions he'd never asked before. Casually, carefully. How are your expenses these days? Are you comfortable month to month? Have you thought about what happens if something unexpected comes up? The questions were framed as concern, but I could hear the calculation beneath them. They were trying to assess risk. I answered vaguely, I'm fine. Not defensive, not dramatic, just final. That answer frustrated them more than panic ever would have, because panic gives people permission to intervene. Calm denies them that power. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law dropped by unannounced. She stood in my doorway, surveying my home like an inspector. Still standing, still clean, still mine. She commented on small things, a creaky step, an old appliance, a crack in the driveway. The things add up, she said thoughtfully. Maintenance can get overwhelming. I manage, I replied. She smiled again. That same practiced smile. You shouldn't have to do everything alone. I looked at her carefully. I've done everything alone for a long time. I said, it hasn't overwhelmed me yet. That was the first time I saw irritation flicker behind her eyes, because I wasn't playing the role she needed. I wasn't weak. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't asking, and that made me unpredictable. After she left, I sat down and opened the folder again. I hadn't planned to. My hands moved on their own. I went through the documents slowly, the accounts that started small, painfully small, the investments made instead of vacations, the savings built instead of luxuries. Every dollar told a story of restraint, of foresight, of nights when I chose security over comfort. I remembered the second job I took and never mentioned, the weekends I worked while others rested, the years I told myself, this is temporary. I had never meant for it to be a secret forever. I had just wanted it to be irrelevant. I wanted my son to value me without knowing, to respect me without numbers attached. But life doesn't always reward quiet integrity. Sometimes it punishes it, and now my silence had allowed them to believe a lie, that I was fragile, that I was dependent, that I was a problem waiting to happen. The irony was almost unbearable. The truth was, I was more prepared than they would ever know, and yet, here I was being treated like a liability. That night, my son called again. This time, his voice carried frustration. We're just trying to help, he said. Why are you making this so difficult? I closed my eyes. I'm not making it difficult. I replied, I'm making it clear. Clear about what? That my life is still mine. He sighed. You're being emotional. That word, the one people use when they don't want to hear the truth. I answered calmly, no. I'm being honest. There's a difference. He didn't respond, and in that silence, I felt something shift. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't worried about losing their approval, because I had already lost something more important once myself, and I wasn't willing to lose that again. The reveal was coming, not as a weapon, but as a mirror, and when it did, they would have to face what they had already shown me. There's a moment in every long story where patience quietly expires, not with anger, not with shouting, but with clarity. That moment arrived for me on an ordinary afternoon. No argument, no raised voices, just a sentence spoken too casually. My son invited me over, saying they wanted to talk things through. I agreed, not because I expected understanding, but because I wanted to hear how far this had gone. We sat at their dining table, everything arranged perfectly, nothing out of place. His wife spoke first. We've been thinking a lot about the future, she said, folding her hands, and we believe it's time to make some firm decisions. Firm decisions. I stayed quiet. She continued, we think it would be best if you sold your house. There it was, no suggestion, no discussion. A conclusion. My son nodded beside her, not confidently, but compliantly. And move where? I asked calmly. She smiled as if she'd prepared this part. There's a lovely assisted living community not far from us, she said, safe, comfortable, structured, assisted living. I felt my chest tighten, not from fear but from disbelief. I don't need assisted living, I said. She tilted her head, not yet, but planning ahead is responsible. I looked at my son. This is what you think. He hesitated, then said, "We just want to make sure you're taken care of." Taken care of, as if I hadn't taken care of myself and him for decades. I asked one final question. "Did you ever ask me what I want?" Silence, not one answer, not one defense. That silence told me everything. In their plans, I wasn't a person with preferences. I was a variable, a future expense, a risk to be minimized. That was the moment the line was crossed, not because of the suggestion, but because of the assumption. They had already decided, and they believed I would comply. I stood up slowly. "I won't be selling my house," I said evenly. "My daughter-in-law's smile faltered. "This isn't about what you want," she said before she could stop herself. "It's about what makes sense." There it was, the truth. I looked at her calmly. "Then let me make something else clear," I said. "I am not your responsibility to manage." My son looked alarmed. "Let's not make this emotional," he said quickly. I turned to him. "I'm not," I replied. "I'm done being misunderstood on purpose." I left shortly after. No shouting, no drama, just distance. But something fundamental had changed. They had shown me who they were when they thought I had nothing. And now, there was no reason to protect them from the truth. That night, I didn't open the folder. I didn't need to. I already knew what was coming. Because the reveal was no longer about defending myself. It was about accountability. They had measured my worth by what they assumed I lacked. Soon, they would learn how wrong they were. And more importantly, they would have to live with what that revealed about them. After that day, the silence between us wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. They didn't call. I didn't reach out. And for the first time, that silence felt honest. I went about my days calmly, almost surprisingly so. The anxiety I'd carried for months had eased. Because once someone crosses a line, clarity replaces confusion. I no longer wondered what they thought of me. They had told me, in their plans, in their assumptions, in the way they spoke about me instead of to me. But something else had changed too. My son began showing cracks, not immediately, but gradually. He started calling late at night, alone, his voice lower, confident. "I didn't mean for things to get so tense," he said once. "I know," I replied, and I did, because this wasn't entirely his idea. But that didn't absolve him. "You seem distant." He said another time. "I am." I answered honestly. "Distance helps me see things clearly." That unsettled him. He was used to me smoothing things over, explaining, compromising, making things easier. This version of me didn't do that. His wife, on the other hand, became colder. She stopped pretending. Her messages were brief, her tone clipped, her concern gone. I could feel the shift. She no longer saw me as a problem to manage. She saw me as an obstacle. One afternoon, she sent a message that finally forced my hand. It was short. "We need to finalize arrangements. This can't be delayed anymore." No greeting, no respect, just instruction. That was when I opened the folder again. Not with hesitation, but resolve. I laid everything out on the table. Statements, balances, long-term projections. I looked at the numbers slowly, not with pride, with understanding. This wasn't luck. It was discipline. It was patience. It was decades of choosing the future over applause. I realized then that I wasn't hiding this truth anymore. I was withholding it, and withholding implies protection. They no longer deserved protection from their own assumptions. But I didn't want to reveal it impulsively. This wasn't about shocking them. It was about forcing reflection. I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. A meeting. I called my son. "We should talk." I said, "All of us." He sounded relieved. "Good. I think that's best." His wife agreed immediately, too immediately. I knew what she expected, compliance. I chose the location, not their home, not mine, a neutral place, because power shifts matter. When we sat down, they came prepared. Papers, suggestions, a plan. They spoke first. About logistics, about timelines, about what made sense. I listened quietly, let them finish. Then I said something that stopped everything. "Before we go any further," I said calmly, "there's something you should know." My son leaned forward, his wife crossed her arms. I reached into my bag. Placed the folder on the table, not opened, just present. "This," I said, resting my hand on it, "is why I won't be selling my house, or moving anywhere, or giving up my independence." They looked confused. My son frowned. "What is that?" I met his eyes. "The truth," I said, and in that moment, before a single page was turned, I saw it, the shift, the subtle recalculation, the realization that maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong. The room changed the moment the folder opened, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. My son leaned forward first, eyes narrowing as the first page came into view. His wife stayed still, but I noticed how her fingers tightened around her purse strap. Silence stretched longer than comfort allows. I didn't explain, I didn't narrate. I let the numbers speak, account balances, investment summaries, long-term holdings, everything clean, everything undeniable. My son swallowed. This can't be right, he said quietly. I nodded once. It is. He flipped the page, then another. His breathing changed, shallower, faster. His wife finally leaned in. At first, she scanned casually. Then her eyes froze. Her expression didn't explode into shock. It collapsed. The confidence drained out of her face like air from a punctured tire. This is... She started, then stopped. I watched her carefully, because I'd known this woman long enough to recognize when calculation replaced emotion. She wasn't thinking about what she'd said to me. She wasn't thinking about how she'd treated me. She was thinking about what this meant, and what it meant was power. My son looked up at me. You've had this all along. Yes, I said. Then why did you let us think? I didn't let you think anything. I interrupted gently. You decided. I simply didn't correct you. That landed harder than anger ever could. His wife straightened her posture instantly. Her tone shifted, softened. Well, this changes things, she said carefully. I smiled, not warmly, not cruelly, just knowingly. That, I replied, is exactly the problem. My son looked confused. What do you mean? I closed the folder. I mean, the way you treated me wasn't based on who I am. I said, it was based on what you assumed I had. His wife spoke quickly. That's not fair. No, I said calmly. What's not fair is deciding my worth after doing the math. She paused, then tried again. We were just worried about stability, she said, security. I met her eyes directly. Then why did your concern appear only after the numbers? That question silenced her completely. My son looked between us. I didn't know, he said softly. I swear I didn't. I believe you, I replied, but belief doesn't undo behavior. He looked ashamed now, not defensive, ashamed. I should have asked. He admitted. I should have stood up for you. Yes, I said simply. That word carried decades. His wife shifted again. Now came the pivot. Well, she said, forcing a smile, we're family. What's yours is no. I interrupted. The word cut sharper this time. No. I repeated. What's mine is the result of my choices. And what you did with your assumptions, that's on you. Her smile vanished. You're being unfair, she snapped. My son flinched. I'm being honest, I replied. For the first time in a long time. I stood up. I didn't show you this to impress you. I continued. I showed you because you tried to control my life when you thought I had nothing. My son's voice broke. I'm sorry, he said. I really am. I looked at him for a long moment. I know, I said, but apologies don't erase revelations. I picked up my bag. As I turned to leave, his wife spoke again, this time colder. So what now? She asked. You're just going to walk away? I stopped, turned, and delivered the line that would stay with them forever. No, I said calmly, I already did. Long before this meeting. And then I left. After that meeting, I didn't hear from them for weeks. Not a message, not a call, not even an apology dressed up as concern. And for the first time in my life, that silence didn't hurt. It confirmed something I had needed to understand for a long time. Peace is not the absence of people, it's the absence of disrespect. I returned to my routine, morning walks, quiet afternoons, evenings filled with books instead of anxiety. My house felt lighter, not emptier, lighter, because I was no longer shrinking to make room for people who only valued space. When they thought it was profitable, eventually my son came alone, no warning, no preparation. He stood at the door like a boy again, uncertain, exposed, stripped of the confidence he'd borrowed from someone else. I needed to see you, he said. I let him in. We sat in the same living room where I once helped him with homework, where I stayed up late worrying about his future, where I believed love was enough to protect him from the wrong lessons. He didn't sit comfortably. He perched. I didn't recognize myself in that meeting. He admitted, and I can't stop thinking about what you said. I listened. I married for what I thought was security, he continued, but somewhere along the way, I started measuring people the same way. That mattered, not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. I just needed you to know I see it now. I nodded. Seeing is the beginning, I said, not the end. He asked about the account, not the balance, but the why, so I told him. About nights I worked late while everyone slept. About opportunities I passed on because they demanded applause instead of patience. About how I learned that real security is quiet and often invisible. I didn't hide it because I was ashamed. I said I hid it because I didn't want money to replace character. He looked down. I failed that test. He said, "You weren't the only one tested." I replied, "You were just the one who didn't know it." He asked about his wife. I answered honestly. She didn't misjudge my finances. I said she revealed her values. He didn't defend her. That told me everything. In the months that followed, things changed, but not magically. There were conversations, boundaries, distance where needed. I didn't rush. Reconciliation, because love that returns only after wealth is revealed isn't love, it's revision. I kept my independence, my home, my choices, my dignity, and something unexpected happened. People began treating me differently, not because they knew about the money, but because I did. I no longer apologized for taking up space. I no longer explained my decisions. I no longer mistook tolerance for love. Money didn't change my life, truth did. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this. People will tell you who they are when they think you have nothing. Believe them the first time. Because when the numbers appear, the apologies will come. But character doesn't arrive late. It was either there from the beginning, or it never was. I didn't lose my family, I found myself, and that was the real inheritance.